Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Former Prime Minister of Canada, Pierre Elliott Trudeau, once said, "We now have a charter which defines the kind of country in which we wish to live, and guarantees the basic rights and freedoms which each of us shall enjoy as a citizen of Canada, and that it offers a way to meet the legitimate demands of our native peoples. That two orders of government have made a formal pledge to define more precisely the rights of native peoples." This was said at the proclamation of the Constitution Act in 1982. However, we as Canadians still hear about the rights of Indigenous peoples being broken and violated by provincial governments and authority, most notably the Ipperwash crisis in 1995, which resulted in the death of Dudley George, an unarmed Aboriginal protester shot by an OPP sniper. Now, ladies and gentlemen, it is important that we remember this dark moment because it reminds us of how Indigenous peoples continue to struggle against the Eurocentric bias found in the Canadian governments and authority. It shows how Canadian governments, specifically the Government of Ontario, continue to disregard Aboriginal treaty rights and concerns as important concerns, and because it reminds us of how the Government of Ontario poorly manages Indigenous land claims because political leaders do not feel that Indigenous culture is important. Ladies and gentlemen, the Ipperwash crisis serves as a perfect example to show how the common narrative, which holds Canada up as a country of multiculturalism and inclusiveness, has cracks, filled with hypocrisy and discrimination. I speak so that I can remind you of the systematic racism prevalent throughout Canada. I speak so that I can remind you that police brutality against a group protest is a growing issue for the criminal justice system across Canada. I speak so that I can expose how the infamous Ipperwash crisis is yet another incident which highlights the ongoing struggle between Indigenous peoples and the Government of Canada. Canada advertises itself as a country which supports multiculturalism, where the integration and combination of cultures from around the world ultimately create Canadian culture. But where is the support and recognition for the culture found here first? In 1988, the Multiculturalism Act was passed, and it stated that every individual has the freedom of conscience, religion, thought, belief, opinion, expression, peaceful assembly and association, and guarantees those rights and freedoms equally to male and female persons. The irony, however, is that the Ipperwash crisis clearly shows how the Government of Ontario and the OPP are hypocrites and enforce the exact opposite of that. The Government of Ontario and the OPP continue to infringe on Indigenous rights and freedoms, as well as restrict Indigenous people from practicing their culture and traditions by taking away their land. Ladies and gentlemen, this type of systematic racism and discrimination towards Indigenous peoples found in the justice system of Canada, especially from former Ontario Premier Mike Harris and the OPP during the Ipperwash crisis, is harmful to Indigenous peoples because it is not only physically harming, but it also has a devastating mental effect on Indigenous peoples. Because of the discrimination from the Government of Ontario and the OPP during disputes such as the Ipperwash crisis, Indigenous peoples view the police as representatives of a culture that is vastly different from their own. Their encounters with police are framed by a history of cultural oppression and economic domination. Leo Bartabog is an Essajano-Petish First Nation from New Brunswick. He was present during the Burnt Church conflict between Micmac fishers, the Department of Fisheries, and the RCMP from 1999 to 2001. He describes Indigenous and police relations as an abusive relationship, and that there is a lack of trust towards the uniform because of what they stand for. He said, "I don't trust them, and I never will, because of what I saw and what they're capable of. Ladies and gentlemen, the Ipperwash crisis reminds us that the use of indigenous languages, laws, and customs were once punished by the laws developed by the same legal structures the police now represent. This history of oppression and domination causes fear and distrust between indigenous peoples and police forces. The Ipperwash crisis also shows how the government of Ontario and the OPP disregard indigenous concerns as legitimate concerns. This in turn makes them feel that they are not obligated to uphold or respect any promises and rights indigenous peoples are entitled to. In 1990, the Oka crisis was a result of a golf course proposing to expand onto a Mohawk burial ground. In 1995, the Ipperwash crisis was a result of the Government of Canada not returning spiritually significant land to the Stony Point First Nations they promised to return. In 2006, the Grand River dispute was a result of the Government of Canada falsely claiming that the Six Nations surrendered their rights to their land, allowing a residential subdivision to be built. Land claims protests are prevalent throughout Canada because Aboriginal treaty rights are protected under our charter, but are continually ignored by the Canadian government. Section 35 of the Constitution Act in 1982 states that the existing Aboriginal and treaty rights of the Aboriginal peoples of Canada are hereby recognized and affirmed. However, this section does not explicitly state the treaty rights Indigenous peoples are entitled to. Ladies and gentlemen, this flaw in our Constitution allows Canadian and provincial governments to alter and essentially rewrite treaties made with Indigenous communities as if those treaties were just words on a paper. Before European settlers arrived in North America, Indigenous communities used wampum belts to permanently signify the agreement of terms between communities. Now, the treaties created by white men for Indigenous peoples are made so that these treaties are unclear and therefore subject to change. The continued modification of these treaties makes it so that governments do not have to honor or acknowledge the promises and rights Indigenous peoples are entitled to. Finally, ladies and gentlemen, it is important to remember the Ipperwash crisis because it reminds us of how poorly the Government of Ontario and the OPP handle Indigenous land claims. The framework for police preparedness for Aboriginal critical incidents states that the role of the OPP is to recognize and respect the fundamental freedoms of opinion, expression, and peaceful assembly enshrined in the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. It also states that OPP employees have a statutory and common law to preserve the peace. The principles of peacekeeping are aimed at minimizing violence, keeping and restoring public order, maintaining neutrality, facilitation rights, and establishing trusting relationships. During the Ipperwash crisis, as well as many other incidents similar to it, such as the Oka crisis and the Grand River dispute, the OPP and the Government of Ontario completely ignored this official policy to peacefully de-escalate a situation. It is plausible that the racist attitudes of former Ontario Premier Mike Harris and the OPP influenced how the Ipperwash crisis was handled. Though racist attitudes held by Harris and the OPP suggest that death or serious injury was an inevitable outcome. Heavy police forces, SWAT teams, the request for the military to be on standby, all were unnecessary when considering that the Ipperwash crisis was a peaceful protest. Now, ladies and gentlemen, we must remember that the Ipperwash crisis was not a unique event. Incidents like Ipperwash have occurred throughout the history of Canada. The Oka crisis, Ipperwash, the Grand River dispute, all results of racism and discrimination in the Government of Ontario and the OPP. All results of the disregard for Indigenous treaty rights. All results of the mismanagement of Indigenous land claims. These are all problems that must be addressed, and it should not have taken until the death of Dudley George, an unarmed Indigenous protester at Ipperwash, for the reform of OPP policies and government mandates concerning Indigenous people. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.